a woman in the county was sexually assaulted. And when she gave the description of her perpetrator, the police immediately went to him. He was convicted, even though he had an alibi, even though he swore up and down he did not do it. He was convicted. He served 18 years in prison. He was exonerated after 18 years when DNA evidence proved it was someone else, and was let out. At that point, because of some faulty investigating, some not great police work, he sued the Manitowoc County Police Department for $36 million. So he goes on about life. 2 years later, a woman named Teresa Halbach comes to his salvage yard to take a photo of a car that's going to go in her publication, her auto trader. She never returns, and they find her blood and some of her charred bones on the property of the salvage yard. Did he do it or did he not? The whole documentary follows this story, and it follows evidence that is damning toward him and evidence that seems to say someone is framing him. In the end, you're left to decide. The police think the making of the murderer was he himself. He made himself a murderer. The filmmakers seem to suggest that someone else framed him and made him a murderer as well as a rapist when he wasn't. The thing they both agree on, and in the end we don't know. And by the way, I don't have an opinion on it because I'm not sure what the guy did. In the end, the only thing they really can agree about is that the injustice in his life, the things that have happened to him, are making him. They're either making him a victim or they're making him a murderer. We don't know. But what has happened to him is making him. We are ending 1 Samuel today. And we are looking at a very pivotal thing that's happening in David's life, and it's making him. And the way he responds to the injustice that's gone on in his life is going to make him one thing or make him another thing. And it's exactly the way it happens with us. Exactly the way it happens with us. We're going to span a number of chapters starting in chapter 27 of 1 Samuel. If you'll turn there, we will get started. As a matter of background, while you're turning there, David has been running from Saul for years. He is tired. He is frustrated. He is angry. He has been afraid. It has been a long, drawn-out process. And right before this, Mike did a great job last week of talking about revenge and how David decides not to get revenge on Saul. He has just had this encounter with Saul. Saul has gone back to the palace. David has gone his way. They are separate. And here we have David now deciding what he's going to do. What he's going to do. Start in chapter 27, verse 1. Then David said to himself, "Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines. Saul then will despair of searching for me any more in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand." So for those of us who have been here a few weeks, not if you're a visitor, but for those of us who have been here a few weeks, what do you notice about that verse that is different than the way David usually operates in his life? He's running. Let me give you a hint. David said to himself, "There is nothing better for me." David thus far, the David we have seen, is the guy who consults the Lord for the direction of his life. Who is he consulting now? He's consulting himself. David said to himself. And what he told himself was that there was nothing better. Nothing better. Not the God who let him take down Goliath. Not the God who had saved him from Saul. There was nothing better than to go hang out with the Philistines. It tells us that there's a state of his soul. Right? He's not himself. This is not the David we know. Furthermore, so in the state of David's soul, he decides to go and hang out with the Philistines. And that's what's going to get him his idea of safety. So David makes a major life decision without consulting the Lord. He has run to the Philistines before by himself. Now he has 2 wives and 600 men and all their families following him. It's not him slipping off. It's him taking thousands of people as a leader over to the Philistines. Let's look at another thing on the state of his soul. By this time, Abigail is one of his wives. Abigail is the woman who kept him from murdering her husband and her family. She reminded him who he was. She is with him right now. Remember what she said in chapter 25. Abigail said to David, "And when the Lord does for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not cause grief or a troubled heart to my Lord." The lady who reminded him that he would be king is his wife. But he's not consulting Abigail. He's consulting himself. In the verse before chapter 27 starts, he has had an encounter with Saul. Saul's last words to him immediately before this are, "Blessed are you, my son David. You will both accomplish much and surely prevail." No danger is coming to David. Everybody's gone home to the palace. But he consults himself. That shows us the state of his soul. Listen to the state of his soul in his own words. This is Psalm 13 that David wrote. "How long will you forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long will you look the other way when I am in need? How long must I be hiding daily anguish in my heart? How long shall my enemy have the upper hand?" How long? This is the place where we get when God seems far away. How long will you be far away? When God seems to be forgetful of what we're going through. And when that begins to happen, he doesn't feel like a God we can consult about every detail of our lives. So we start consulting ourselves. We've been there, haven't we? I have. I slip into that place too often. He's consulting himself. And so David is in a dire place. There's a little book that if you are interested, and I would encourage you, it's a classic book about this happening, and it's called A Tale of Three Kings. Has anyone read A Tale of Three Kings? Oh, it is awesome. It goes over the relationship, it studies the relationship between Saul and David. And then the second half of the book examines the relationship between David and Absalom. Those are the three kings. I'm going to quote from that book because Gene Edwards, who wrote it, says it better than I ever could. This is part of the state that David's soul is in, and why he goes to this foreign land and what God is doing. David would reach a foreign land in a small, very small measure of safety. Here too he was feared, hated, lied about, and plotted against. He shook hands with murder on several occasions. These were David's darkest hours. We know them as his pre-king days, but he didn't. He may have assumed this was his lot forever. Suffering was giving birth. Humility was being born. By earthly measures, he was a shattered man. By heaven's measure, a broken one. God had allowed David to be ground down. In fact, I believe God not only allowed it, but God ordained David to be ground down. Because there was something in David that was not ready to be king yet. And God allowed him to show forth what was going on inside of him, to give an evidence of a shortcoming. It was part of David's making. It was injustice. It was part of his making. What is the shortcoming that was in David? Let's go ahead and start in verse 5. David goes to the Philistines. He goes to the capital of the Philistines, which is a city called Gath, and at the time, Achish was king of the Philistines. The Philistines had 5 kingdoms, 5 areas, 5 lords, and 1 king, but all of them ruled together. They were like an advisory board, kind of. Achish was king, he was chief justice, and that the other ones were helping. That's how their government went. He made friends with Achish, and we see the beginning of what was in David that God had to address. This is verse 5. Then David said to Achish, "If now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country that I may live there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was a year and 4 months. So it just sounds like everything is good. But what had happened is David defected. He defected to the Philistines, so they thought. He had to do something to prove he was loyal to them. So he would go on raids, and he would bring back all the spoil to the king, until he found favor with the enemy of his people, to the degree that he said, "Oh, look at us," and he came off very humble. "Look at us, there's so many of us. We should not be crowding this capital city. You just give us a small place off somewhere, and we will just live there." But the truth of the matter is in the evidence of this shortcoming, David did not want Achish to know what he was doing. And so David shows that he's a deceiver. And when things get down, he will deceive to get what he wants. It gets worse. Achish gives him that land, and David goes on raids for the king of Philistines. Look at verse 8. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, for they were the inhabitants of the land from ancient times, as you came to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive. And he took away the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, the clothing, and he returned and came to Achish. Now Achish said, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David said, "Against the Negev of Judah, and against the Negev of the Geramielites." Oh, goodness. "And against the Negev of the Kenites." David did not leave a man or a woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, "Otherwise they will tell about us." Saying, "So David has done, and so has been his practice all the time he has lived in the country of the Philistines." So Achish believed David, saying, "He has surely made himself odious among his people Israel. Therefore he will become my servant forever." David makes raids for Achish against his allies, the Amalekites, and these other people that I'm not going to try to say their name again. were the allies of the Philistines. And he'd come back with all the booty, present it before the king. The king would say, "Where did you raid?" He said, "I went into Judah." David killed and lied to accomplish his idea of say and say. He would completely wipe out every man, woman, and child so no one could come and tell the truth about it on these raids. The last evidence of his shortcoming that in his dire straits starts coming out, his go-to, his flesh go-to, happens in 29. The Philistines gather to attack Israel. Achish says, come on, bring your men. We're going to fight against your own people. And David says, okay, I'm coming. Let me show you what I can do. He goes, and they meet the other 4 lords, and the lords say, there's no way. We're not letting you come. You'll turn and fight against us. Listen how Achish tells David to go back home and continue raiding for him, that he can't fight in the war. Listen to how David responds. This is verse 6 of chapter 29. Then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives. Stop right there. Lord here is the word Yahweh. It is the covenant name of Jehovah God of Israel, and the king of Achish is speaking his name. The king of the Philistines is speaking the name Yahweh. Everything that David does is pointing to David's God. So that Achish has taken on this name. All right? Continue. Okay, pause off. Play. As the Lord lives, you have been upright, and you're going out and you're coming in with me, and the army are pleasing in my sight. For I have not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord's. How deeply has David deceived him? David deceived in order to look good to the man he had been using. Okay, so what have we got in David here? What is coming out? And had to be in the dire straits of being ground down. What's coming out? He's a deceiver. He's a murderer. He's a liar. And he's a user. And all of it is pointing to Yahweh, to the kings of the Philistines. Who knew? This is not the David we have studied, the valiant warrior, the honoring man. Who knew this was in the depths of David? God knew it was in the depths of David. And God knew that he couldn't be king in this state. Let's look at Gene Edwards again from our Tale of Three Kings. He says this very, very well. David the sheep herder would have grown up to become King Saul II. Except that God cut away the Saul inside of David's heart. That operation, by the way, took years and was a brutalizing experience that almost killed the patient. And what were the scalpel and tongs God used to remove this inner Saul? God used the outer Saul. King Saul sought to destroy David, but his only success was that he became the instrument of God to put to death the Saul that roamed about in the caverns of David's own soul. Yes, David was virtually destroyed in the process, and this had to be. Otherwise, the Saul in him would have survived. The Saul that we have been studying is a man who would resort to deception, who would throw his spear at David, an innocent child, who would do these things. But the truth of the matter is, that kind of flesh, that kind of self-life resided in David too. And God had to know that the next king would not be King Saul number 2. Saul is a picture of us doing life on our own for ourselves, in our own way, in our own power. It is the picture of flesh. That's what the Bible calls flesh. David, who David was truly as king, who he became, is the picture of spirit. None of us are born Davids. If you'll remember, and those of you who were here and have studied this or know this, Saul was appointed and placed on the throne. Not so David. David was made. And David was made through suffering. It's a hard one to grasp, isn't it? But there's a Saul in all of us. And what goes on in our lives is a gift from God to reveal the Saul in us that we don't know exists there, so that he can keep us moving on toward the David he knows that we are. An interesting concept. And even though it dawned on me, this passage, these scriptures are not really well known by a lot of people. This is huge to God. It is huge to him. So God allows another thing to happen. Because what has happened to David is it's working for him. He's getting away with it. But he is stuck. He is stuck in a doom loop of just surviving and being the person that he is not supposed to be. But he's getting by. So God allows something to happen. And this is chapter 30. So David and his men are in Gath. The lords of the Philistines are saying, no way, you may not go to battle with us. Go back home. So they return to Ziklag. It's about a 3-day period that they have been gone. They round the corner, drive down their street, come home to find the entire village burned and everyone gone. Someone has raided while he has been gone. And no one is left, and everything is burned to the ground. They weep, they mourn, they can't believe it. Some of his very faithful men talk about killing him, mutiny, they hate him, what's going to happen? As this comes to the forefront, it's a scare. All of a sudden, what David's been doing isn't working for him, and it's the grace. It's a grace scare. Look at the first thing David does in verse 7, chapter 30. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Amalek, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. For the whole year that David has been in Philistia, we have never once had a record of him seeking the Lord for guidance and obeying him. It wasn't happening. Grace, but even the grace of a scare drives us back to the Lord, doesn't it? Boy, we can get in a rut, can't we, in life? Well, we're just spinning the plates. We're just keeping it moving. But any time we get a chance to look back at who we are, we realize we're not being who God called us to be necessarily. When God allows a scare, it's a grace, and it drives us back to the Lord. Stuck is the best we can get when we are operating away from God. And we know what stuck is. David finally does what he has not done in a year. He seeks God. But look at the beauty. Look at the beauty of this. All he had to do to get back under grace was ask. David doesn't sacrifice animals here. He doesn't go and repent to Achish. There's a God waiting for us in our stuckness, in our awayness, who just wants us to come and ask. Help. I am not who I should be, and my life is not looking like it should. Help. When God answers him and says, pursue them, that's what they do. They decide to go after them. They don't know who it is. They don't know what's going on. So they break up into smaller bands and they go out into the desert. And they find, one of the little bands finds a little guy. He's an Egyptian slave of the Amalekites. He's almost dead. They give him something to drink, something to eat. They interview him. They find out he's a slave of one of the Amalekites that came back and raided and burned. He was sick. The Amalekite left him for dead, and they found him. Look at verse 15 of chapter 30. Then David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band. What are the chances? What are the chances? That one little guy got sick. That Amalekite said, just stay here and why don't you die in the desert? And then he stayed alive, and then they found him, and he knew who they were and what they had done and where they had gone and their habits, and he was willing. Grace makes a way when there is none. That stuck feeling is awful, awful, awful. But if we will simply return and ask, suddenly, if we will watch, if we are King, there is a way made out into a new place, the place where we should be operating. So David goes, they find them partying, they're all drunk, they're so happy about all the stuff they've gathered, and they attack. Look at verse 18. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives. But nothing of theirs was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. David brought it all back. Grace makes us able to accomplish God's will. God's will was done in this situation to show David that obedience is the best way to enjoy grace and the only right way to be king. Now, if David had behaved like this, and I was God, you were God, what would we have done? I'd have taken him to the woodshed. Sometimes God does discipline us. But look at the heart of the Father who had watched his boy stray off. Watched his boy and let it and ordained it happening. Watched the stuff come out of his man, even though it was painful. So he could swoop in with grace and remind him, come back, there's a better way. There's a better way. This is the making of a king. It's the making of a man. It's the making of a woman. It's the things that we go through that God not only allows but ordains to reveal in us the flesh he wants to crucify. He wants to take to the cross, drag that flesh kicking and screaming to the cross so that the David, the Spirit, life in us may increase. It's a hard one, isn't it? Gene Edwards puts it in good words here. He's talking about this process when it happens to us. You have your eyes on the wrong King Saul. As long as you look at your king, spouse, parent, child, boss, whoever it is causing you problems, you will blame him and him alone for your present hell. But be careful, for God has his eye fastened sharply on another King Saul, not the visible one standing up there throwing spears at you, one just as bad or worse. God is looking at the King Saul in you. Saul is in your bloodstream, in the marrow of your bones. He makes it the very flesh and muscle of your heart. He is mixed into your soul. You are King Saul. Did he just call us King Saul? It's the same with all of us. I know I've told this story before, but it's what so clearly comes to mind. Years ago, going through difficult situation. More stuck than I probably ever had been. And it was at the hands, supposedly, of one person. After it was over and I was recovering and I couldn't remember, I couldn't figure out, I couldn't see why God let it all happen, I asked him, Lord, why? Why did I have to go through that? Why was it so long? Why was it so arduous? Why did it never stop? And in prayer with a friend, one day, the Lord gave me a picture. He was standing behind me. I was in my home. He was standing behind me. And I realized, okay, all that time I couldn't see you. When you seem so far away, when you seem to forget, all that time you were standing behind me. And his arms were reaching around me, and he was doing this. What was he doing? He was pulling out the Saul in me. I get it. I personally don't see much more David in me. So still waiting for that. But that's what he's doing with all of us. When we encounter difficult times, there's a verse that we love, and for good reason. It's Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. We love that verse. And you know what we can do with that verse? We can think about that good. And then we make the picture of what that good is, don't we? I'm going to get a promotion. My husband or wife is going to change. My kid is going to become mature. The teachers and administrators at school are going to get what needs to happen with my child. They're going to come on board. My parent, my mom, my dad is going to stop that flesh. They're going to stop those comments that they've been doing all their lives. It's going to be awesome. And we define that good, and we are waiting for it. Come on, bring it. All things. I am so ready. So ready. We love verse 28. Do we love verse 29? Because good is defined in 29. For those he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. That's the good. It's our becoming. It's our making. It's our making into a murderer or a victim. Our making into a wanderer or a king or a queen in the kingdom. It all has to do with how we respond to what God allows in our lives, to what we let unfold before him, and to what we let his grace do in our lives. It's a high thing, a high calling, when he allows that process. Right? Right. Let's pray. God, you are good. Even though it comes in a package we would never have ordered, you are good. And we will yield to you. We ask that you give us that grace and allow us to be open and allow us to see the evidence of King Saul, that you may bring it to the cross, that you may cut it out, and that you may increase your spirit in us. Increase us into David's. And Father, I pray over this group of people that you would truly and truthfully bring forth David's in every quadrant of their lives, who will be mighty people for you. We love you and we trust you and we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.